There is this tension between privacy laws saying data minimization, while AI market use saying we need more, because more data generally means better models. Most companies aren't building their AI tools from scratch, and so that is a potential vulnerability.
Welcome to AI Council Code. I'm your host, Maggie Welsh, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that is hard to separate from all the buzz with AI. It's privacy and cybersecurity. And we're joined with Michelle Molner of Baker Bots, who specializes in this very area and has a lot of experience dealing with privacy and cybersecurity as it relates to AI tools and AI deployment. So stay tuned for some interesting insights.
Baker Bots, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
So, Michelle, thanks for being on our podcast. Why don't you introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Thanks so much for having me, Maggie. I'm excited to be here. I am a senior associate in Baker Bots' privacy and cybersecurity practice. I sit in Austin, Texas, and my practice spans a couple different roles. I do quite a bit of privacy compliance counseling. I assist with negotiating data agreements. There's breach preparation and breach response. Recently, I've been advising a lot on AI governance, AI data hygiene, and protective measures around AI models and vendors.
Okay, and so I know that you work at the intersection of privacy compliance, defensive security, and real time incident response. So, from where you sit, it might feel like we're at this inflection point, balancing new mass AI adoption with pre existing privacy obligations and then nonstop breaches and cybersecurity issues. So, to start off, can you give us an overview of the most common privacy and security concerns that arise with AI tools today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, on the privacy side, the concerns that we see most often fall into a couple different buckets. The first is training data, specifically whether any personal information or other sensitive information was used to train AI models without adequate notice or consent from those data subjects, as well as whether that information can be extracted from a model after the fact. Another bucket on the privacy concern side is inferential privacy. So, this is the risk that an AI system can infer sensitive attributes about a person, like health status or political views, from the data that was provided that seems innocuous on the surface, but ultimately does create new information about this individual. The third is data minimization. So, traditional privacy laws tell companies to really only collect what they need and use it for only the minimum purposes that they need it. AI kind of flips that instinct because more data generally means better models. And so there is this tension between privacy laws saying data minimization, while AI market use saying we need more. On the security side, we're hearing a lot about prompt injections, which is when a bad actor embeds malicious instructions into content that the AI system then ingests. Prompt injections cause the system to behave in unintended ways, purge sensitive data, for example. There's also model inversion attacks. This is when an attacker reverse engineers a model to extract data that that model was trained on, including potentially sensitive data that model architects thought may be protected from a model inversion attack. Another sensitive security issue that comes up with AI models is data poisoning. This is when a bad actor corrupts training data in order to manipulate the model's output or the model's behavior. And then, of course, there's supply chain risk, which is just the idea that most companies aren't building their AI tools from scratch. They're integrating third-party models, third-party APIs, plugins. And so each of those integration points is a new potential vulnerability. So far, this is just talking about the vulnerability points of AI environments themselves. This isn't even really getting into how AI is being used to carry out attacks.
One question we get a lot is the difference between internal AI tools and then the public AI tools or public models. So, if you are a company and you're using an internal AI tool that's brought within your firewall, your system, does that take care of a lot of these security and privacy concerns, or is that really a false sense of security?
So it's a really good question. Internal AI tools are somewhat safer, but they're not totally safe in the way that people often assume. The main advantage of an internal tool is that you as a company have more control over the data that that model is trained on, more control over where the outputs go, and more control over the access controls. You're not sharing a model with the general public, and so there's also less risk that your proprietary data surfaces in someone else's output. But the thing is, internal tools introduce their own risks. So, for example, they are often fine tuned on the company's own sensitive data. So that creates latent exposure risks. Additionally, access controls for internal tools are frequently broader than they are for public tools used within a company, and frankly, broader than they should be. There's a false sense of security there. Likewise, internal AI tools often get less rigorous security testing than third-party tools would because, again, the assumption is that the threat is all external. But in practice, it's not necessarily true. Insider risk and misconfigured access are major threat actors. So internal tools definitely deserve scrutiny as well.
And let's talk about data, which I know is near and dear to your heart as a privacy attorney. What are we seeing in terms of data exposure with the AI systems?
Yeah, so there are a couple types of data that are in a way categorically new and unique to AI. The first that stands out is sensitive training data. So this is the risk that personal and proprietary data that's embedded in the model's training corpus can surface through carefully crafted prompts, right? These are the prompt injections that we were talking about and the model inversion attacks. Companies that use their own internal data to fine tune their models need to take this quite seriously. The second type of data that's in a way categorically new here is synthetic data. This is data that we assume is de-identified, but in fact isn't often as de-identified as people think. AI generated data sets are increasingly used as a privacy protective alternative to real data, but research has shown that synthetic data can actually be linked back to real individuals in some cases, particularly where it is combined with other data sets that does contain real data. The third type of somewhat categorically new data to be at risk of exposure is behavioral inferences. This is what was mentioned earlier. It's the ability for AI systems to infer things about individuals that that individual never truly disclosed directly. This is like net new information. So, for example, an AI system trained on purchasing behavior could potentially infer health conditions or financial stress or relationship status about the individual with somewhat meaningful accuracy.
Let's talk about cybersecurity. How is AI being integrated into cybersecurity, both defensively and offensively? And how do you see it anticipating the incident response?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, on the offensive side, unfortunately, AI has lowered the barrier for entry for threat actors to carry out pretty sophisticated attacks, especially en masse. We're seeing AI generated phishing emails that are far more convincing than what we saw even 2 or 3 years ago. AI is also being used to automate certain parts of the attack process. So, for example, recon, identifying companies who are good targets for a cyber attack, generating malware very quickly, if not instantaneously, sometimes. Additionally, deepfake audio and video are being increasingly used in social engineering attacks. So AI is absolutely being already weaponized and masked by threat actors on the offensive side. That said, on the defensive side, AI is already proving to be very valuable and is progressing pretty rapidly. Defensive cybersecurity always lags offensive threat strategies just a little bit. It's just the nature of the game. But IT teams are already using AI to proactively scan their own networks for new vulnerabilities, to identify new anomaly patterns that they otherwise would not have caught, to triage incident alerts, to prioritize threats faster than any human analyst could at this point. The volume of security data that organizations are generating these days is just absolutely enormous, and it's not going to slow down. We are going to increasingly generate more and more data with more and more sensors. And so AI has been really helpful in making that data readable and actionable. On the incident response side, AI does complicate some things in a couple different ways. So, for example, forensic attribution becomes harder because AI generated attack code is harder to fingerprint to a specific threat actor. Additionally, scope determination is a bit more difficult when an AI agent is involved. Blast radius is harder to reconstruct because the systems may have been accessed in a way that weren't logged the same way it would be if a human threat actor had accessed those systems. The third way in which incident response is a little bit different is notification obligations. They often get a bit more complicated to understand whose information has been impacted and therefore who needs to be notified, because an AI threat actor may ingest data from multiple sources simultaneously. And so we can't just go to the HR folder on the corporation's network and say, all right, it's just this data repository that has been accessed. And so we know everyone in this data repository will get a notice. It's a bit more complicated.
What's a good piece of advice then for in-house counsel when they might need to be dealing with an incident response?
Yes, I'd say that the traditional process for incident response remains largely the same, regardless of whether it's a human threat actor or a human leveraging AI in its attack. It just requires, if we understand that an AI agent has been leveraged in the attack, it just requires a bit more diligence in either going off of the exact data that has been leaked, for example, onto the dark web, rather than reconstructing it through our own means, or if we're reconstructing it through our own means, to be extra diligent to understand that there may have been many more systems than are traditionally accessed in a human-initiated attack.
So, shifting back over to privacy, we're seeing a lot of privacy enforcement at the agency level and at the state level within the United States. As an in house attorney thinking about AI governance practices, what are some things that attorneys should be looking for and watching out for with respect to these privacy enforcement efforts?
Yeah, so there are a couple different signals that we're getting from regulators. The first is that they're not waiting for AI specific legislation. Yes, there are AI frameworks and executive orders happening at the federal level. There are variously scoped AI laws happening at the state level, but by and large, regulators are mostly using tools they already have. So this is like the FTC Act, state privacy laws, industry privacy laws, and they're applying these existing laws to AI conduct. The laws are largely tech agnostic, and so they apply regardless of whether a person is handling data or an AI system is handling data. So, to give a couple examples, the FTC has leaned on Section 5, unfair and deceptive practices, to punish overstatements about an AI's capability without actual testing or validation to back up those overstatements. Similarly, EU regulators with the GDPR have focused on lawful basis, whether a company has lawful basis to use certain personal information for AI processing when it may have been collected for initially a different purpose, as well as the idea or the right of deletion. The right of erasure is what the GDPR calls it. This is a bit more complicated, and in fact, much more complicated when someone's personal information is not just in an Excel sheet record, but it's actually been baked into a model through ingestion. Likewise, state privacy laws are being applied to AI profiling and AI automated decisions. So the first signal really is that companies shouldn't think of their AI use as only regulated by AI laws, and they shouldn't wait for AI laws in their particular jurisdiction. The privacy laws that are existing and the consumer protection laws that are existing do apply to their AI use and leveraging. The second signal that we're getting from regulators is that process matters a lot, almost as much as outcomes. Regulators want to know that companies are conducting their risk assessments, they're conducting data privacy impacts, they're doing bias testing, that they had policies in place and that they followed those policies, that they tested their systems. And ultimately, a company that has a very thoughtful governance process and still experienced a problem is in a very different position than one that had no process at all. There are a couple warning signs that I would flag for in-house counsel based on what we've seen regulators enforce and focus on. The first is if you have an AI tool that is making consequential decisions with limited to no human review. That is a fairly big flag that we're seeing regulators focus on. And the second, if a model is training on data that was collected for initially a different purpose. Also, if you're making marketing claims about the AI's accuracy or safety that aren't necessarily backed by hard testing or validation, or if your AI products are aimed at sensitive populations. These are like children, the elderly, people in financial distress. Those are very sensitive topics for regulators.
And what are you seeing as the biggest mismatch right now between regulatory exceptions and current business practices?
So I'd say one that we see very frequently, the biggest gap is around documentation. This goes back to what we just talked about process being key. Regulators really want to see that companies are assessing AI risk systematically. A lot of companies are doing informal risk management, but they're not generating documentation that demonstrates a defensible compliance posture. And that's a pretty meaningful gap if a regulator ever comes knocking.
Okay, so let's talk about practical implementation. If you're at a company and you're looking to onboard a third party AI tool, an AI vendor, what should you be thinking about from a privacy and security standpoint to make sure that your boxes are checked?
Something that almost every AI client has asked us is the specific question because most vendor contracts weren't at the time and still aren't written with AI in mind. And so at the moment, we are advising on how to add it in. So on the contracting side, companies should push for a couple different provisions that are protective to them. The first is clear identification of which of your data and your customers' data the vendor can actually access, use, and the purposes for which it can use that data. The second is clear ownership of model inputs and outputs. You want to make sure that your company retains full ownership of the inputs and and the outputs of the model as appropriate. We get some vendor pushback on that one, but that puts the company in best case scenario. Third is prohibition on using your or your customers' data for model training without your consent. This is one where there's a little bit of flexibility depending on the company's interests. Fourth, robust security obligations, of course. And fifth, meaningful indemnification. There is almost always an existing indemnification provision, but we want to make sure that it includes the scope of AI output. If there is ever AI output that causes harm in the real world, we want the contract to be clear on who is liable for that harmful output and whether there is indemnification of the company by the vendor. Aside from contracting, your vendor due diligence process should also shift slightly to account for AI. Your procurement team shouldn't just be relying on the vendor's self-reported metrics and security, especially for high-risk vendors. These are like HR AI vendors. You should be independently validating their models, bias testing, or their SLAs through a third party. And you should treat vendor oversight as an ongoing obligation, not just a one-time checkbox. Vendors update their product constantly, and given how fast AI products change, new capabilities, new data practices, new integrations, one-time review at onboarding likely doesn't suffice.
And besides from vendor due diligence checklists, another area that I know we advise clients on a lot is their AI use policy. And there's a lot of focus on what data should be put into public models as well as within the internal models. And I think we all understand by now you shouldn't put confidential, sensitive data into the public AI models. But what are some of the less obvious data ingestion risks that companies should be thinking about that they might not be thinking about?
Prompt risk is real. And to your point, I think a lot of us understand at this point that employees absolutely do need to be trained on the risks around, for example, accidental disclosure or IP infringement or hallucinations, bias. But because it's one of the more visible risks, it is also one of the more controllable risks, right? You can implement training for your employees. Some of the less obvious risks are the ones that are harder to manage. For example, API integration access control. So when a company connects AI tools directly to their internal systems via API, that tool is often consolidating data from a bunch of different repositories in a way that maybe no individual employee could actually do otherwise without this tool. And it's providing oftentimes the same output for all users, regardless of their role or their access privileges. And this could unknowingly create some pretty significant confidentiality issues if data repository access controls are not, again, reinforced at the AI retrieval layer for each user. Another risk is output data classification. If employees are using AI to draft documents or draft code and the AI pulls from a confidential source, the employee may inadvertently be creating new records that contain either the same confidential data or maybe some version that's synthesized. And those new outputs from the AI tool may not be automatically classified at the right level of sensitivity or handled in the same way as the underlying source material.
So many attorneys, I know ourselves included, are asked to evaluate AI tools all the time and bringing AI tools into the way we work and how we do our business. And I know that a lot of attorneys at companies as well are asked similar questions about whether this AI tool is appropriate for use or secure enough for internal use. What's one practical piece of advice around cybersecurity and privacy that you could give to attorneys today when they're evaluating these AI tools or for AI deployment?
I would say getting a seat at the table before deployment is exceptionally important. Before deployment, not after. The single most common mistake I see is lawyers being brought in to review an AI tool that's already been built or already been procured. At that point, your options are pretty limited. You can flag issues, but the organization has already invested in the tool and the appetite for meaningful change is pretty low. On the other hand, if counsel is involved early during, for example, vendor selection or internal tool development or scoping of a new AI use case, you can shape the outcome and your compliance stands much, much better. You can influence what kind of data the system has access to. You can influence what access controls look like or what logging and audit trail looks like. So those architectural decisions are very hard to change after the fact, but early involvement is where lawyers really add the most value in this space.
Thanks, Michelle. And to close out, is there one piece of advice or one takeaway or something that we should be watching for in the next year with respect to privacy and cybersecurity?
I would say something that we should look out for and that I anticipate we're going to be talking about a lot over the course of the next 12 to 18 months is agentic AI liability. And I know you covered AI agents on a recent episode, so your listeners do have some context here. We're at a moment where these systems are moving from just being in demo phase to now actual widespread deployment. And these are tools that can browse the web on our behalf, can execute code, can manage files and emails. They can take actions in the real world on behalf of their users with sometimes quite limited human oversight. The legal frameworks for assigning liability in those cases, when, for example, the AI does something harmful, it might access data, it could take an unauthorized action, right? That legal framework is extremely underdeveloped at the moment. And so we're going to see over the near term future the first wave of significant litigation and regulatory enforcement around agentic AI. The outcomes at the moment aren't very predictable. And so that uncertainty in and of itself is something that companies should take into account when they're deploying these agentic AI tools.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks to our listeners for listening to AI Council Code. We're so glad that you joined us. Stay tuned for additional podcasts and more insights on AI legal issues from Baker Botts.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Bots podcast. Baker Bots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Bots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Bots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.